Democracy has long been considered the political ideal. The US claims to be the bastion of democracy as it pursues its imperial and settler colonial exploits. Israel says it's the only democracy in the Middle East while it carries out genocide. And democratic governments around the world justify their rule with reference to the popular mandate of elections. And on the other hand, radical movements champion democracy in their workplaces and communities. The struggle for real democracy motivates scores of would-be revolutionaries. Many of us around the world live under countries which claim to be democracies, whether we believe they accurately reflect the democratic ideal or not. But democracy has a lot of problems regardless of which form you prefer, and if you're willing to hear me out, I'm going to spend the rest of this video explaining why. Now, I'm someone who believes that authority, in the sense of the right to rule, is an obstacle to the flourishing of both individual freedom and social cooperation. That makes me an anarchist. If that term makes you think of violent chaos, stay to the end of the video. I'm going to sketch out what an anarchist alternative to democracy might look like. You can also go watch my video on how anarchy works before getting into this one. I have a lot of problems with democracy, which may come as a surprise to those sympathetic to anarchism who believe that it is about pursuing real, direct democracy. We'll get to that. This work aims to break down what democracy really means and point out its flaws, especially with reference to anarchist critiques. Throughout and in the end, my aim is to lay out a clear and consistent vision and language of anarchism, pushing back against the idea that democracy is the best we can do. To begin with, we should probably define democracy. Most people, upon hearing the term, think of a form of government, and for good reason too. For over 2,000 years, democracy as a term has existed neatly within the framework of state politics. Even with efforts to challenge this association, democracy is commonly understood to mean a system of government, more familiarly one in which the majority of the people elect representatives to make decisions, policies, laws, etc. Such governments may exist on some defined index between hybrid, flawed, or full. They may be parliamentary or presidential. Yet around the world, these democracies maintain the close collaboration of the capitalist and governmental ruling classes which uphold a regime that deprives and exploits the masses, overrides popular will, and neutralizes dissent. This creates a growing sense that our democracies don't live up to the democratic ideal. After all, the rule of the people here is a system where participation is reduced to merely legitimizing different rulers through electoral rituals. Representative democracy is the modern disguise for the tyranny of the elite, a way for them to make their domination appear collectively approved and just. As articulated in Rethink, From Democracy to Freedom, laws, courts, prisons, intelligence agencies, tax collectors, armies, police, most of the instruments of coercive power that we consider oppressive in a monarchy or a dictatorship operate the same way in a democracy. Yet when we're permitted to cast ballots about who supervises them, we're supposed to regard them as ours, even when they're used against us. This is the greatest achievement of 2.5 centuries of democratic revolutions. Instead of abolishing the means by which kings governed, they rendered those means popular. Representative democracy offers a pressure valve. When people are dissatisfied, they set their sights on the next elections, taking the state itself for granted. Indeed, if you want to put a stop to corporate profiteering or environmental devastation, isn't the state the only instrument powerful enough to accomplish that? Never mind that it was the state that established the conditions in which those are possible in the first place. Perhaps, despite having a legitimate claim to the term, representative democracy isn't representative of how democracy should be defined. Well then, perhaps we should look to those from whom we inherited the romantic ideal of democracy in the first place. Enter Athens. In political theorist Robert A. Dahl's On Democracy, he identifies Athens as the prime example of participatory democracy from ancient times. First adopting their system in 507 BCE, the Athenians receive credit for coining the term democracy itself, from the Greek words demos, the people, and kratos, rule. The city-state of Athens was governed primarily by an assembly in which all male citizens, a minority of the population, were entitled to participate. Aside from electing a few key officials by vote, other public duties were selected by lottery, also known as sortition. Athenian democracy had its critics in its time, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle among them, Socrates saw government as something best left to expertise rather than popularity or chance. Plato viewed democracy as the second worst form of government after tyranny, which it was doomed to eventually become anyway. And Aristotle preferred to mix democracy with oligarchy. All three could rightly be considered authoritarians with no care for popular participation, especially considering what their critiques didn't highlight: that Athenian democracy excluded women, non-citizen resident men, and slaves, which together made up the majority of Athenians. This unrepresented, disenfranchised population provided, to quote one prominent advocate of direct democracy, the material means for many Athenian male citizens to convene in popular assemblies, function as mass juries in trials, and collectively administer the affairs of the community. Ancient Greek democracy clearly flourished at the expense of the majority. As Rethink put it, the space of participatory politics was a gated community. Yet even many of those with the privilege to participate often abstained, as anarchist Bob Black highlights in Anarchy After Leftism. Of the tens of thousands of Athenian men who enjoyed the privilege of citizenship, the assembly could only accommodate a few thousand, and even then, as few as 3,000 to 6,000 men actually participated. Keep in mind, these are slave owners. They definitely had free time. The Athenian example has had significant influence on the development of political philosophy, but its actual institutions had little influence on the later development of representative democracy. Neither Athens nor the Roman Republic, which would later inspire the American Republic, actually established a system based on democratically elected representatives that most recognize as democracy today. In Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, anthropologist David Graeber argues that we shouldn't consider Athens the birthplace of democracy, since the idea of gathering all the members of one's community in order to make joint decisions in a way that gave everyone equal say was hardly a Greek invention. He says that we don't consider the organization of the Haudenosaunee, Amazigh, Sulawesi, or Talensi societies as democracies due to a perhaps racist Western bias around voting, since they instead sought consensus. We'll get back to his definition of democracy in a moment. For now, I'll leave it at this. As Rethink argues, and I concur, why claim that the Greek term democracy is overly biased to the Greeks who invented it and the institutions that claim it, while insisting on expanding the term to characterize non-Western peoples with their own terms for their own systems? Later in his work, Dahl defines democracy according to the extent that all the members are to be treated under the Constitution as if they were equally qualified to participate in the process of making decisions about the policies the association will pursue. He further lays out a criteria of equal opportunity for participation, voting equality, equal opportunity for understanding policy, control of the agenda, and the inclusion of all adults. Dahl emphasizes that these criteria describe an ideal democracy as a standard against which actual democracies can be measured and improved. He judges existing democratic countries as having not fulfilled the democratic ideal. But although Dahl rejects the practicality of direct democracy in large modern states, other advocates of democracy steadfastly see the potential for the democratic ideal to be realized by direct democracy. Some take direct democracy to mean direct control over the state itself. The entire citizenry voting on laws and policies, either through physical ballots or digital technology. Some advocate for the citizenry to participate in local assemblies which send delegates to regional assemblies which send delegates to national assemblies. Some define direct democracy as any participatory decision-making outside of the state. They make a distinction between the state and government by rejecting the state while pursuing participatory government through popular assemblies. This position is best exemplified in the Zapatista territories in Mexico, which attempt not to abolish authority as anarchists would, but rather to disperse authority and hold it accountable through participatory government. In There Never Was a West, Graeber identifies democratic practice as procedures of egalitarian decision-making or government by public discussion outside the purview of the state. Under his broad banner of democracy, he groups together majority democracy and consensus decision-making. He also points to the democracy being at times identified in the masses against the elite, and even goes as far as to call the democratic state a contradiction. Bookchin was another semi-famous advocate of stateless direct democracy, first when he claimed to be an anarchist, and later when he established his own ideology, communalism. But unlike Graeber, Bookchin didn't bother with consensus. He stood for democracy plainly understood as majority rule, which is far from anarchist. Bookchin insisted that his municipal assemblies represented a radical alternative to the state, but dispersing state authority is not the same as abolishing it. You might also find advocacy for anarchist democracy, real democracy, or true democracy in the works of Lorenzo Camboa Irvin, Wayne Price, Kevin Carson, and a few other popular late 20th and early 21st century anarchists. Each one varies in their interpretation of democracy, ranging from the vague though potentially anarchist-compatible collective decision-making of Graeber to the plainly authoritarian majoritarianism of Bookchin. Beyond these, many other mutually incompatible systems have each state claim to the prestige of democracy. Meanwhile, historical anarchists either hardly spoke about democracy at all or actively condemned it. All the way back in 1851, Proudhon wrote, "We may conclude without fear that the revolutionary formula cannot be direct legislation, nor direct government, nor simplified government, that it is no government." Lucy Parsons wrote, "It is better to have majority rule than to have minority rule, which is only in the interest of the few. But the principle of rulership is in itself wrong. No man has any right to rule another man." Bookchin wrote, "In short, we reject all legislation, all authority, and every privileged, licensed, official, and legal influence, even that arising from universal suffrage, convinced that it can only ever turn to the advantage of a dominant, exploiting minority, and against the interests of the immense, subjugated majority. It is in this sense that we are really anarchists." Many other anarchists, past and present, have shared similar sentiments. Yet some anarchists today wish to stake claim to democracy. I fundamentally disagree with this semantic appropriation. Such anarchists typically insist on a broad, idiosyncratic definition of democracy that encompasses all forms of collective organization, discussion, and decision-making. But the origin, dictionary definitions, and history of democracy lies predominantly in rulership. Even if we could erase democracy's centuries-old state governance connotation in common parlance, we still have to contend with the etymological cues embedded in the word itself. They indicate something about how democracy has worked in practice. Democracy, from the ancient Greek demos kratos, reflects its political tradition. Demos is typically translated as people, and kratos as power or rule. The people, the demos in a democracy, are not all people. Sometimes the people is a minority of the population, sometimes the majority, but never all people. Though there have been efforts toward greater inclusion, democracy ultimately decides who gets to decide, whose voice and which decision-making spaces are and are not legitimate. There are citizens and non-citizens, the electorate and the disenfranchised, the people and the other, historically distinguished based on gender, race, age, and nationality. Power, or rule, or kratos in a democracy necessarily entails the tools of rulership, a way of enforcing the binding decisions of its people upon everyone in its defined boundaries, historically through a legal apparatus, police force, or military. In modern Greek, kratos refers to the state. As the poet Oscar Wilde famously put it, democracy means simply the bludgeoning of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy, the rule of the people, is distinct from anarchy, or if you prefer, acracy, the absence of rule. Anarchy is popularly misunderstood as a situation of dispersed rulership, either in the sense of chaotic power struggles or mere decentralization, rather than the absence of rulership. But correcting that misunderstanding at least has etymological weight behind it. Let me be clear, etymology is not the be-all and end-all of a word's meaning. But the historical meaning and political development of democracy has been deeply tied to its etymological roots in rulership, which clashes with anarchism's rejection of rulership. Anarchist democracy is, at least on its face, an oxymoron which muddies already muddied waters. It invites unnecessary ambiguity, as well as co-optation, leaving room for those who cannot conceive of a world without rule to peddle their positions under the guise of anarchism. I've read advocates of anarchist democracy who insist that all the mechanisms of rulership being placed under collective control could make even law and policing anarchist. Other advocates have assured me that anarchist democracy simply describes free, horizontal, and participatory decision-making without authority. Yet this only underscores the confusion that arises when democracy is affixed to anarchism. If democracy can be understood to imply both law and policing and the absence of legal order altogether, then the word only obscures rather than clarifies. The language of democracy is not indispensable. We already have words like free association and consensus. Why compromise them with the baggage and ambiguity of democracy? Because some people have positive associations with the word? The same could be said for many other popular concepts that are incompatible with anarchism. The words we use shape our thoughts, which shape our practices. If anarchists continue to conflate direct democracy with anarchy, they may very well reproduce its many, many flaws and limitations. What begins as a compromise in language risks becoming a compromise in practice. First of all, democratic processes concentrate legitimacy and are intended to result in collectively binding decisions. Whether in the form of a parliamentary assembly or a popular assembly, the legitimate space of decision-making and its procedures are elevated above all. The process might be open and participatory, but the collective's decisions carry a weight that must be imposed. As anarchist Yuri Gordon notes in Anarchy Alive, this is incompatible with anarchist processes. Disagreement in anarchy is something to negotiate or coexist with, not override. There is no concentration of legitimacy, and no one is bound to obey decisions they don't consent to, even if those decisions were made by the people. In the words of Rethink, real freedom is not a question of how participatory the process of answering questions is, but of the extent to which we can frame the questions ourselves, and whether we can stop others from imposing their answers on us. Further, for all the focus on the legitimacy of its outcomes, the procedural rules of democracy are quite arbitrary. In his pamphlet Debunking Democracy, anarchist Bob Black notes that there are no self-evident democratic voting rules. Majority or plurality, proxy voting, quorums, are supermajorities, 3/5, 2/3, required for all, some, or none of the decisions. Who sets the agenda? Are motions from the floor entertained? Who decides who gets to speak and for how long, and who gets the first or last word? Who schedules the meeting? Who adjourns it? And who decides, and by what rules, the answers to all these questions? Gesturing to the practice of gerrymandering, he also notes that the definition of the constituency within which the count is taken is a matter of primary importance. Redraw the boundaries, and the majority becomes minority or vice versa, although no one has changed his mind. Speaking of which, democracy invents its majorities and minorities and positions the former over the latter. These categories come into being through the act of voting, which simplifies and aggregates individual preferences into collective blocks. Democracy then imposes a structure where one bloc is empowered to dictate over another. The minority is made practically powerless. This is hardly soothed by potential for them to become part of the majority in the future, since in practice, democracies tend to create permanent minorities. And besides, as Black puts it, preference varies in intensity, but consent does not. Preference is more or less, consent is yes or no. It doesn't matter if one might become part of the majority for future measures if the intensity of their preference and urgency of their stakes on this particular measure is overridden by the mass. And since the dictates of the majority are no more likely to be correct on anything than a minority, individuals should not be obligated to accept the rule of either. There is no need to elevate either of these abstract blocks. Without the mechanism of the ballot and its compression of complexity, they are only individuals, autonomous and responsible for their own desires, opinions, and actions, not majorities or minorities. Another flaw in the majority rule of democracy is that it hardly reflects the literal majority of the people. I previously mentioned the low rate of participation in Athens, but the same could be said for direct democracies elsewhere. Even if, as Black notes, technology could do for modern democratic citizens what slavery did for Athenian citizens, the persistent demands of direct democracy might result in the same low participation. Few have the cerebral stamina for lengthy debates. Not everyone is as extroverted and assertive as political forums demand. Not everyone is keen on regularly attending formal political meetings, preferring instead to deliberate in informal conversations and more intimate breakaway groups where issues can be discussed more effectively. Not all eligible voters will vote every single time, meaning majority rule could very easily become plurality rule. For some, the idea of participatory democracy itself conjures up parody, best recounted by political theorist Michael Walzer. Imagine a day in the life of a socialist citizen. He hunts in the morning, fishes in the afternoon, rears cattle in the evening, and plays the critic after dinner. But the sketch needs to be elaborated. Before hunting in the morning, this unalienated man of the future is likely to attend a meeting of the Council on Animal Life, where he will be required to vote on important matters relating to the stocking of the forests. The meeting will probably not end much before noon, for among the many-sided citizens there will always be lively interest even in highly technical problems. Immediately after lunch, a special session of the Fishermen's Council will be called to protest the maximum catch recently voted by the Regional Planning Commission. And on it goes. You get the picture. The dream of a fully participatory democracy collides with the reality of human limits in time, attention, and language. Robert A. Dahl raised a similar concern. He recognized that while democratic ideals emphasize broad participation, basic arithmetic highlights its impracticality. If, for instance, a popular assembly has 100 citizens, and each were given some arbitrarily deemed sufficient time to speak, say 10 minutes, then the time required for a meeting would quickly spiral into absurdity, consuming days' worth of everyone's time. Society would have to come to a complete standstill to ensure everyone could deliberate over every policy proposal. And this isn't even getting into the limited carrying capacity of language when compared to the speed and complexity tucked within each human brain. In practice, as Dahl notes, opportunities for participation rapidly diminish with the size of the citizen body. Although many more can participate by listening to speakers, the maximum number of participants in a single meeting who are likely to be able to express themselves in speech is very small. These fully participant members become, in effect, representatives of the others, except in voting. Thus, even in a unit governed by assembly democracy, a kind of de facto representative system is likely to exist. Yet nothing ensures that the fully participating members are representative of the rest. Indeed, at scale, direct democracy tends to incorporate elements of representative democracy, either de facto or de jure. Athens had the Council of 500, chosen annually by lot, which set the agenda for the meetings of the Citizen Assembly. Some proposals for direct democracy embed systems of recallable delegation, which move upward from local assemblies to regional assemblies to even national assemblies, which creates majorities of majorities of majorities, resulting in what is ultimately a grassroots minority rule. Democracy, like hierarchies in general, also struggles to process and adapt to complexity. As anarchist Frank Miroslav highlighted in We Don't Agree on Capitalism, for individuals and collectives seeking to command others, they must reduce their actions to a set of instructions, like an algorithm. Yet the world is too complex, too full of unpredictable inputs and possibilities for such directives to ever fully succeed. Living systems, people, social networks, environments, even simple objects repurposed in creative ways, generate outcomes that cannot always be anticipated from above and from the center. Hierarchies, participatory or not, must compress and filter information to make it manageable, stripping away nuance. But this structural failure does not collapse the entire system, because those ruled will often carve out informal zones of autonomy to keep things functioning. Factory workers, office workers, educators, and even soldiers often develop unofficial methods to get tasks done more effectively than the rigid, sometimes impractical procedures handed down by their management. Yet in spite of the clearly necessary value of autonomy, hierarchical systems will often prioritize control over effectiveness. Thus, hierarchy is structurally irrational. It seeks to control an unpredictable world and resists the very autonomy that makes effective adaptation to such a world possible. Democracy's practicality is further undermined by the various theorems and paradoxes of voting theory that reveal the fundamental difficulties in designing fair voting systems. I'll only describe two of them, and I'm no expert, so feel free to verify my explanations. The Condorcet paradox demonstrates that majority preferences in ranked voting can cycle incoherently. The majority may prefer A over B over C, but C over A, producing no clear winner. And McKelvey-Schofield's chaos theorem reveals that in multidimensional policy spaces, majority rule is unstable, meaning it can be manipulated through agenda control to yield virtually any outcome. We should also consider the social consequences of democracy. Black described democracy's majority rule as belonging to a combat theory of politics, a contest between opposing forces, the outcome being victory for one side and defeat for the other. The public, face-to-face environment of a direct democracy can produce social disharmony, as citizens are forced to regularly confront and oppose their differences. Over time, this polarization may result in interpersonal and psychological outcomes such as resentment, erosion of trust, alienation, withdrawal from participation, and emotional, irrational decision-making. If given the choice between reasoning and persuasion, a skilled speaker with limited time allotted will generally choose the latter if they want to win the crowd. Skilled speakers, strong personalities, and, in Walzer's words, men with the most evenings to spare, have a profound capacity to shape democratic outcomes. You see this often in activist spaces. For every committed militant and professional activist who pours their whole life into the work, there are those part-timers and non-committed, those who will attend only sometimes, according to their whims, interests, and external duties. Few want to adopt the suffocating burden of regular engagement, the almost religious pressure to attend every church service, especially considering the type of person such spaces attract. Black calls them the democratic man, as he is typically a man. Face-to-face democracy is in-your-face democracy. To the extent that the tireless typicals turn up, they discourage those not so afflicted from participating actively or returning the next time. The same types who'd get themselves elected in a representative democracy tend to dominate, by their big-mouth bullying, a direct democracy too. Normal and non-obsessive people will often rather appease the obsessives or even kick them upstairs than prolong an unpleasant interaction with them. And so, the minority of political obsessives, given an institutional opportunity, tend to have their way. This may be a mean-spirited characterization, and Black is most certainly in a glass house throwing stones at the personalities of others. But if you've ever organized in real life, you may have met people who approximate this archetype. Even without formal titles of authority, highly engaged and charismatic personalities emerge as the de facto gatekeepers of democratic spaces, as their voices carry further and their proposals pass more easily. Federal agents can also take advantage of democratic dynamics to disrupt and misdirect radical movements. The openness of participatory democracy, combined with the concentration of legitimacy within its assembly, makes it vulnerable to both the rule of an informal elite and the surveillance and infiltration of bad actors. The Democratic Assembly's legitimacy is itself premised on the older distinction between polis and oikos, highlighted by Rethink, between the public sphere of legitimate decision-making and the private sphere that sustains but remains excluded from it. In Athens, the polis was the supposed city of equals, while the oikos was the patriarchal domain of male property owners. From polis we get politics, polity, and police. From oikos we get economy and ecology. And democracy still depends on this split. The household economy, with its invisible and unpaid labour mostly carried out by women, as well as the vast resources of ecology, are subordinated to the sphere of politics. Perhaps steps can be taken to equalize the burden of household responsibilities and further encourage the participation of women in traditionally male-dominated public assemblies. Or perhaps, while still equalizing domestic responsibility of course, rather than continuing to subordinate every sphere to the supposed legitimacy of the public assembly, we can affirm the equality of multiple sites of power with, but deny any of them the claim to legitimacy. I'll return to this point later. When one side of decision-making is elevated to the exclusion of all others, it intensifies the group pressure to conform. If you want your voice to count, you must enter the assembly and either conform to its procedures and decisions or be excluded from meaningful influence. The overwhelming majority, or committed minority, can intimidate those who might otherwise dissent. And as social psychologist Solomon Asher's conformity experiments demonstrated, a sizable minority of people will succumb to group pressure even when the evidence contradicts them, and even when there aren't any real stakes. Over time, the very act of repeatedly submitting to majority decisions, tolerating informal hierarchies, and deferring to procedural legitimacy reinforces people's conditioning to obey. This is what anarchist Lazar M. calls democracy's pedagogy of obedience. The procedure itself, and those who manipulate its agenda, is elevated above the real people it claims to serve. Anarchists refuse to delegate responsibility to democratic procedure. With the freedom to act that anarchy affords, comes the responsibility for one's actions. Where democracy trains obedience, anarchism must cultivate both freedom and responsibility. Democracy, for all its promises, reveals itself insufficient to realize the anarchist pursuit of liberty and mutuality. It elevates its arbitrary procedures as legitimate and binding upon all, reduces individual preferences into artificial antagonistic blocks of majorities and minorities, and conditions obedience rather than cultivating autonomy. Even when designed to be participatory, direct democracy collides with the limits of time and attention, as well as a structural failure to process and adapt to complexity. The popular assembly may, in the end, devolve into representative democracy or the rule of informal elites with the dedication and personality to dominate. We are often told, echoing Churchill's famous line, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, as if no alternative exists to government itself. But we are not bound to choose between flawed systems of rule. Anarchism offers an option worth exploring on its own terms. First, a reminder. Anarchism is a philosophy, practice, and movement that opposes authority and proposes the unending pursuit of anarchy. Authority refers to the right above others to give commands, control resources, and enforce obedience. Anarchy refers to a world without such rule, where autonomy, mutuality, and free association form the basis of our society. While the status quo puts forward socially destructive individualisms and self-dissolving collectivisms, anarchism emphasizes that individual freedom and social cooperation are inseparable and mutually reinforcing. To understand anarchy, we must think outside the box, beyond the assumptions of democracy. Rather than accepting that certain spaces or procedures have a monopoly on legitimacy, anarchy denies such claims. There is no individual or collective that has the authority to permit or forbid the actions of others. No concept of legality or illegality. Anarchy would be an illegal society. Here, the full responsibility for one's freely chosen actions informs the fabric of social interaction. None can hide behind authority or majority approval. None are compelled to consent to violations of their autonomy or safety. Since every act may invite responses known and unknown, avoiding destructive cycles of action and reaction requires careful attention to those affected. Best practice will no doubt entail consultation and the negotiation of mutually acceptable solutions. Anarchy has no citizenship, no demos, so there is no separation between those who do and don't have the right to participate and decide. And anarchy does not seek rule, kratos, so rather than enforcing decisions and binding obligations, it cultivates free agreements that rest on assent and respect dissent. Anarchist Shawn Wilbur noted that we often imagine an organized society as a body with a head that directs it. Some want that head to be a patriarch, a capitalist, a dictator, a theocrat, a parliament, or even a directly democratic collective. But the assumption that societies need such a head goes unchallenged. In anarchy, society is a headless network of individual and group relations that emerges from free association. The organizing principle based on the ability and initiative of each individual to associate or disassociate with others according to their specific interests, goals, or desired actions. Groups become means to an end, rather than ends in themselves. We shouldn't be afraid of disassociation. Splitting from a group is not a threat or a complete break in ties, but a natural reflection of different interests between people who may still remain interdependent. Group decision-making thus begins from points of consensus, identified through free association instead of forced cohesion. The people who want to pursue a project are the ones with the responsibility to work out the details and account for potential consequences. Within groups, free association continues to shape decision-making. Individuals group around the approaches that resonate with them, negotiating with others in the group holding different views. Decisions are further shaped by the availability of labor, expertise, resources, as well as personal preference. Agreements within and between groups and individuals emerge through dialogue and compromise, and they persist for as long as participants freely affirm them. Such agreements are always adaptable and never binding beyond the living assent of those involved. In this way, consensus is less about producing a uniform collective will than consenting upon autonomy. The popular assembly, once a presumed center of decision-making authority for some defined territory, becomes an open space of encounter, where people of diverse interests can share their offers and needs, meet with others of common interests, and negotiate agreements. Other spaces of encounter might flourish in libraries, schools, warehouses, factories, stores, offices, and farms. And we will certainly see affinities identified beyond today's artificial borders, as people connect online and collaborate on passion projects and critical needs alike. Shared interests only sometimes conform to geography. We might also see such spaces become nodes in consultative networks that exist on a local, regional, continental, even global scale. These would gather and disseminate data, expertise, and feedback so that interested and affected individuals and groups can easily access what they need to make informed decisions on everything from ecology to construction to medicine. Anarchy may be unprecedented, but in its pursuit, we will find that within each of us there is already a spark of that beautiful idea. Indeed, we already have some sense of how to act anarchically in our day-to-day relations with those we love. The challenge is to recognize this ability and build upon it, to deepen our drive for freedom and foster an anarchist consciousness that rejects all authority and embraces communal individuality. There is no need to compromise anarchy with democracy. It can stand on its own terms. So that those of us who share this pursuit of freedom assert with pride, in the words of Ercole Malatesta, we are neither democrats nor dictators, but anarchists. All power to all the people. Peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Thanks to the seedlings, the saplings, and especially the roots for making all of this possible, including our newest members, Leah Chilton and Ms. Legendary. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/SaneTrue, or right here on YouTube with a YouTube membership. Check out my other videos for a range of radical topics. Thanks again. Peace.